Cadets, thank you very much indeed, and it's a great privilege to be here in an inspiring city, in an inspiring country. And a very big thanks to everybody that's been involved in setting up these Grand Challenges meetings. But the truth is, we live in somewhat uncertain times. If those of you who were there in London just 12 months ago remember, we commented on the upcoming US elections. And just in case I ever thought about going to have a bet in the future, if that election and Brexit taught me one thing, it's best to keep to the day job. But these elections should not just be seen in isolation. Whether Brexit, US elections, recent German elections, they are telling us something, and we as a community need to heed what those lessons are. As Cadets has just said, I spent 18 years in Vietnam, and I moved back to the UK about 3 years ago, thinking I was coming back to a European, liberal, outward-going, a country that had come to terms with its past, at least to some extent. The food had improved, and sadly, as a result of climate change, even the weather was somewhat better. Many of those things in June 2016 look slightly different, and we should reflect on that. When politics and the community and society itself and our own community are all working in a similar direction, things are relatively easy. We don't think they're easy at the time because we see the great challenges ahead of us, but the truth is they are easy. But when things are not quite so simple, and when there may be headwinds, and when society is more fragmented and more people question the utility and the value of what we do, then those are the times for us to seize that moment and double our efforts and make sure that we do have a voice and we support those who speak on our behalf in the great corridors of power. It is, I believe, a responsibility and an obligation. Because in truth, the world has made quite phenomenal progress. In my working lifetime, and as reflected in the recent IHME, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Lancet publications around the global burden of disease, the number of people lifted out of poverty just in my generation, child mortality rates, life expectancy, these have all improved beyond what we could have reasonably thought 20 or 25 years ago. And this year is also a time to celebrate. It's a time to celebrate the election of Dr. Tedros to the Director General of the World Health Organization. I believe the first African leader of a major UN agency. And at the heart of all of those advances in society and in health has been science, has been technology, has been innovation and innovators, and has been at the core of those advances. But we do now face serious challenges. Societies are fragmented. There is a sense of mistrust. There is a breakdown, to some extent, in all countries, of trust between the governed and the governing. And inequality within and between countries has grown. I take no pride in the fact that living in the UK at the time of the Brexit election referendum, I know nobody that voted to leave the UK, and yet 52% of my country people did. That says something about the fragmentations of the societies we live in. And the progress that we've made, while staggering, is fragile. And if we deviate from the investment and the support we give to our own world of global health, but also the health of all of our own citizens, then that progress is fragile. To quote a previous US president, the only thing necessary for bad things to happen is for good people to stand back and do nothing. And we do face a rapidly changing world. We heard from Tony Fauci earlier on about the emergent infectious diseases. We're moving from a small world defined by a local community, a village, a small town, and a very big planet. We're moving to a big world and a small planet where we are all interconnected. There will be people in this room that were in Washington yesterday, but there'll also be people here who were in Nairobi, Cape Town, Beijing, Lagos, London, Geneva, and all parts in between. We're moving into the era where man's impact on the environment is now starting to reach that tipping point which will affect everything we do. But once again, if we believe, if we push, if we use our voice, then science can. Science can provide the solutions, technological innovation, the innovators, and if we ensure that those individuals and teams are brought together internationally to work across borders, then we can address the great challenges of our time. Today, we honor the Nobel Prize winners. Appropriately for a gathering such as this, it's gone to 3 individuals working on sleep and jet lag. But as we honor those individuals, and quite rightly that we do, we should not forget the ecosystem and the environment in which they thrived as young and then more senior investigators. And so much of that environment and so much of that ecosystem is down to the support, the sustained support, the long-term investment of governments around the world. And the US, you have been the exemplar of that. I pay tribute here to Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, Roger Glass, who is not here, but the brilliant director of the Fogarty International Center. You have led the world in the way that government supports science and then lets people get on with it in a way that allows them to innovate and pursue their own interests. You've done that for your own country, but the rest of the world has benefited from that enormous investment. We would not have an Ebola vaccine today were it not for the investment of NIH in the early days of that development. And we do need, and I believe we can, get other governments to step up into that regard. And as well as NIH, of course, there is BARDA and DARPA. There's PEPFAR, CDC, the President's Malaria Initiative. And we at Wellcome Trust have been very lucky to work with many of those on a number of those different projects, from the human genome, increasingly discussions about the human cell atlas, H3 Africa, CARB-X, CEPI has already been mentioned, and CARI. But governments are the only ones that can provide that infrastructure. And that allows foundations such as ours and many others in this room to do other things, to complement, to take risks, and to do things which perhaps governments can't do in a complementary way, whether the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, the Science Philanthropy Alliance, which is bringing together a number of different foundations to work on fundamental science, EAT Foundation, Institut Pasteur, and many more. And we should never forget, in London at the Wellcome Trust, that Henry Wellcome was an American. It's what you do when you offer somebody a knighthood. And similarly, you've allowed to work with industry. You've allowed government to work with industry in a way that many other countries could learn from. Industry is a partner in what we do and should ensure that they are at the table and that we influence and bring our own values to bear on the way industry. But this is not possible to improve the health of the citizens of any of our countries or the citizens of the world without bringing together governments, foundations, and industry along with the citizens that we all serve. And we do face those political headwinds. And at times like this, we need to speak up with that responsibility and obligation. And we need to get out of our bubble, and we need to challenge ourselves. We need to broaden what we mean by science. If you look at all of the great challenges of the 21st century, whether climate change, emerging infections, drug resistance, the coming globally of the non-communicable diseases, and we just heard a beautiful talk about cancer, cardiovascular disease, the demographic shifts, the burden of mental health, people denying the benefits of vaccines and growing inequality around the world, how we will use the genomic revolution for the benefit of the maximum number of people, and how we will maximize the use of digital to bring better health and education to everybody. Whilst technology, innovation, and innovators will be part of that story, they will not be the story on its own. These will not be solved by one country. They will not be solved by one narrow definition of science. This will require us to work much more closely with social scientists, with people from the arts, with people from the humanities, from behavior. It will involve engaging with philosophers. And it will require us to bring greater diversity to the leaders and the leadership of all of this around the world. Because in the end, science will only thrive and science will only bring its great benefits to the world if it has the support of the society in which it operates. And we have become complacent about that, and we must not take that for granted. We need to break down the barriers within science. We need to break down the barriers between science and society, and we need to ensure that we do not erect new barriers between nations. In my youth of the 20th century, we spent an awful lot of time building walls and then tearing them down. Let's not spend the 21st century building new walls between nations or between scientists. And together, science can. It can be that force for good. It can be that force that improves people's lives and takes people with us, that links communities and links nations. And as inevitably and represented in this room, the center of gravity for that endeavor shifts. It will shift. It is shifting already. African Academy of Sciences in Nairobi is one example of where the shift of center of gravity, supported by many in this room, decisions are now held, they're made, and they're implemented, not in London, not in Washington, not in Geneva, not in Beijing, but in Nairobi. Together, science can address the great challenges of our time, and I've never been more optimistic about the ability of science to deliver for everybody. But we need to make sure that we reach out beyond our own bubble, and we must make sure we reach out and take society with us. And I would show my one slide, but it's not working, so I won't. But perhaps even more importantly than that, perhaps we should also raise our eyes above our science space and even our global health space. Because actually science does something even more profound than that. In a period of inequality, science also brings a much greater degree of social mobility. It brings social cohesion. It allows people from any background to rise to whatever level in any country in the world. And at a time of growing inequality, when societies are more divided than ever, science can play a role in that common agenda to address that common problem. And we've underestimated the ability of science to raise not just global health, but also to raise the very condition of humanity. So those of us working in global health can be that voice. We need to make it stronger than ever. We need to get out of our bubble, and we do need to support the leaders, particularly in Washington and beyond in this country, as they argue for their case for the continued long-term stable investment in science infrastructure that allows those great Nobel Prize laureates and their teams to thrive in the modern world. And finally, I would just like to pay tribute to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think we are now in the 13th year of the Grand Challenges meeting. It has been transformed, it's brought people together, but perhaps most importantly, although you are the drivers of this, it now doesn't feel like a Bill and Melinda Gates meeting. It feels like a meeting that we are all part of, that we all contribute to, that we all provide leadership to. And I don't think there's a greater tribute, and on behalf of everybody in this room, extend my thanks and everybody else's thanks to you for the generosity of spirit with which you take your foundation, which is what makes your foundation great, and its reflection on what makes this country great. Thank you very much.